What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G 5G and the BLU Bold N2. Now before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Moto G 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 81.4% screen-to-body ratio. With the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a 6.6-inch AMOLED display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 390, an aspect ratio of 19.5:9, and a 90.9% screen-to-body ratio. So both of these phones do have pretty good displays, but in general, I would say the BLU Bold N2 does have a significant advantage here. First of all, with an AMOLED display versus an IPS LCD, the BLU Bold N2 has much better display technology, and this is going to give the phone much better looking colors, and the viewing angles are also going to be significantly better. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, the BLU Bold N2 is going to be quite a bit easier to see than the Moto G 5G. In addition to this, with a 1080p resolution versus 720p, the BLU Bold N2 is going to have a much sharper image, which tends to be a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content. Now that being said, with the Moto G 5G, while in my opinion the display still isn't nearly as good as the BLU Bold N2, it does have a couple slight advantages. First of all, with an aspect ratio of 20:9 versus 19.5:9, the Moto G 5G does have a slightly taller and more narrow form factor, and this is going to give you a more immersive experience in landscape mode, and if you're doing something like reading or scrolling through social media, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. In addition to this, with a 90Hz refresh rate versus a standard 60Hz display, the movement on the screen with the Moto G 5G is going to be a little bit faster and smoother, so it's going to feel a little bit more premium. And when you're doing something like watching a video or playing a game with motion on the screen, things are going to look a little bit smoother and more fluid overall. But that being said, the refresh rate along with the slight difference in the aspect ratio is really subtle, whereas with the BLU Bold N2, having a higher resolution and a better display technology does make a huge difference. So if you're consuming a lot of content and you want to make sure you have a really good display, I would say the BLU Bold N2 is going to be a better choice here. Now both phones do have 256GB of internal storage, but with the Moto G 5G, we are getting microSD card expansion, whereas for whatever reason, we're not with the BLU Bold N2. Now, in my opinion, for almost anyone, 256GB of internal storage is going to be plenty, and you're probably not even going to need a microSD card. I mean, even for me personally, I have an iPhone 13 with 128GB of internal storage, and of course, being an iPhone, my phone does not have microSD card expansion, and I've personally had no issues whatsoever, and I would say, although I'm not the biggest power user out there, I do use more space than the average person. So again, for most people, 256GB of internal storage is going to be plenty of space even without microSD card expansion, but if you have a lot of photos and videos, for example, and you really do want that extra space, then the Moto G 5G will have a slight advantage. But again, seeing that both of these phones have so much storage as it is, I really don't think this will be a concern for most people. Now for security features, both phones have fingerprint scanners. With the Moto G 5G, it's right here on the power key, and with the BLU Bold N2, it's right here in the display. So definitely looks nice and premium. And in addition to the fingerprint scanners, these phones also have face unlock as well. But that being said, starting with the Moto G 5G, let's go ahead and give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And moving on to the BLU Bold N2. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners worked real well, no issues whatsoever. And again, remember, both phones also have face unlock, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the Moto G 5G, we got a nice looking hole punch design for the front facing camera, and this camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. For video, this phone has a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so nothing really out of the ordinary there. Now with the BLU Bold N2, we got this little island here for the front facing camera. Kind of reminds me of the new iPhone 14 design, or maybe a Samsung Galaxy S10 or something. Not quite a hole punch, but definitely still looks nice. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. I also want to point out this camera module looks really cool, and the back has this unique kind of leathery material that's definitely not something you see every day. But overall, as far as the features go, neither phone has a bad setup here, but the BLU Bold N2 does have a significant advantage, seeing as this phone does have an ultra-wide camera, whereas the Moto G 5G only has a macro camera. In addition to this, for video, the BLU Bold N2 can record in 2K in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. Now 2K in my opinion is not really that useful, but at the same time I will say the BLU Bold N2's videos in general are a little bit better than the Moto G 5G, so if you are going to be recording more videos, definitely keep this in mind. In addition to this, I would say the overall camera quality with the BLU Bold N2 is a little bit better, so that's definitely something to think about too. In general, I would say between these two phones, if you're going to be taking a lot of pictures, and that's really a priority for you, the BLU Bold N2 will be a better choice here. But if you're more of a light user when it comes to the camera, and you really just want to get a couple nice photos here and there, maybe for social media or something, in that case, the Moto G 5G will still get the job done. Now, as far as RAM and processor go, with the Moto G 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. With the BLU Bold N2, we're getting 8GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 810 processor. And in case you didn't know, the BLU Bold N2 is in fact a 5G phone as well. Now that being said, I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and with the Moto G 5G, we're getting a single core score of 545 and a multi-core score of 1684. With the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a single core score of 586 and a multi-core score of 1685. So as you can see, these phones have pretty much the exact same performance here, and in general, as far as my experience goes, this has been pretty consistent. So overall, I would definitely not use processing power as a deciding factor between the two phones, because you're really not going to see a significant difference in performance. But that being said, for more normal activities like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and more mid-level mobile gaming, both of these phones are going to be perfectly fine for that kind of activity. Sure, they're not going to be nearly as fast as something like a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE for example, but for mid-range phones, they will get the job done. Now as far as the battery goes, with the Moto G 5G, this phone has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 10W fast charging, and the BLU Bold N2 has a 4200 mAh battery that supports 30W fast charging. So there are some significant differences here. On one hand, the Moto G 5G has a clearly larger battery, so if you want the phone between the two that has the best battery life and longevity, the Moto G 5G will be the way to go. On the other hand, with a 4200 mAh battery, while not being nearly as large as the Moto G 5G, the BLU Bold N2 still doesn't have a small battery, and in my experience, the battery life, while not being as good, is still definitely acceptable, and for most activities, it will get you through the day. The other difference here is the BLU Bold N2 has much better fast charging, so if you do have a powerful fast charger, you will see a significant difference in charging speed here. But that being said, of course, not everybody cares about fast charging, and if you either don't have a fast charger, or maybe you leave your phone plugged in all day anyway, you're not even going to notice this difference at all. But in general, while both phones do have really good batteries, when it comes to this area, I would personally say the Moto G 5G has the main advantage here, because in my opinion, having a larger battery is probably going to be a little bit more valuable to most people than better fast charging. Now another thing to keep in mind here is that neither of these phones have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, definitely keep this in mind, because you're not going to be able to do that with either of these phones. In addition to this, keep in mind the BLU Bold N2 does not have a headphone jack. For whatever reason, BLU decided to leave that feature out, so if you do use wired headphones, definitely keep this in mind. But that being said, the BLU Bold N2, unlike a lot of phones that don't have headphone jacks, does actually come with a pair of USB-C headphones and an adapter, so it's not really that big a deal with this specific phone. But all the same, if you do actually want a phone with a headphone jack, the Moto G 5G will have an advantage. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, despite these phones being pretty close in a lot of areas, I would personally go with the BLU Bold N2. The first reason for this is the display. Sure, the Moto G 5G really isn't bad, but with an AMOLED display and a 1080p resolution, you're going to get a much better experience with the BLU Bold N2. In addition to this, the BLU Bold N2 does have a much better camera setup, with not only an ultra-wide camera, but just better photo quality in general. And overall, the phone itself just has a slimmer, more unique, and just more premium feeling design. But that being said, the Moto G 5G again is not a bad phone by any means, and it does have some advantages, like having microSD card expansion, a 90Hz refresh rate on the display, a noticeably larger battery, and a headphone jack. So at the end of the day, while I personally do think the BLU Bold N2 would be a slightly better device, the Moto G 5G is definitely not a bad option, especially considering some carriers do have this phone, whereas with the BLU Bold N2, you are going to have to get this phone unlocked. So as far as pricing and deals go, you're most likely going to get a much better deal with the Moto G 5G than you will with the BLU Bold N2. But at the end of the day, despite their differences, both of these phones are great devices that do provide quite a bit of value for the money. But this concludes my comparison between the Motorola Moto G 5G and the BLU Bold N2. Again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.